Today, we'll be looking at an ancient hunting partnership between the people on the south coast of New South Wales and killer whales. We'll also be looking at how perhaps a combination of occupational dental wear, a dental accident, differences in the bacterial ecology between different animal species, and chronic infection just might help to explain the mysterious death of a much-liked killer whale, Old Tom. Well, we're here in beautiful Eden on the south coast of New South Wales, and this is Thua traditional land of the Yuin Nation. And the reason why I'm talking today is that yesterday we visited the magnificent Killer Whale Museum here in Eden. When you go into the museum, there's a fabulous skeleton of a killer whale, and it turns out that this is a particular killer whale. This particular whale had a name, Old Tom. Now, I should really just give a bit of background that Aboriginal people living here have had a long-standing relationship with the killer whales. For untold thousands of years, killer whales would herd other whales into the bay. Eden is on a bay, twofold bay. They would herd other whales into the bay, and they would strand the whales that they chased into the bay on the coast, and they would then kill them and eat them. Now, Aboriginal people came to collaborate with the killer whales, and they would help to kill the whales. And what would happen is that the killer whales would only eat the lips and the tongue of the whales that they had chased into the bay, and the Aboriginal people would then eat the rest, or use the rest of the whale for whatever they were doing with them. I suppose mostly food, I don't know. But with time, that became a long-standing relationship, and indeed Aboriginal people believed that upon death they would be effectively reincarnated as killer whales. So they felt a real kinship with these wonderful beasts that they had a hunting relationship with. Now, in the 1800s, European whalers settled down here in Eden, and they learnt to collaborate with the killer whales from Aboriginal people. And what would happen is that the killer whales would herd in a whale from out in the ocean into the bay as they had previously. Then they would swim round to where the whalers were. They would splash their tails on the water to alert the whalers that there's a whale to be killed. Then the whales would leap in the boat, and the killer whales would actually often grab hold of the rope from the boat and actually drag the boat out to where the whale was to kill the whale. And that was this a terrific aid that the whalers had, because if they didn't actually have this help, they would have needed far more people to actually run the business. But they were able to get away with about a third as many people. And many of the whalers were in fact Aboriginal people who came to work with the European whalers. So now what would happen then is that the whalers would leave the dead whale just floating in the water. It would sort of sink, and then the killer whales would eat the lips and the tongue of the whale that had been killed. And with time, the gut of the dead whale would fill up with gas, because there are bacteria in there that break down food, and I suppose the dead flesh of the whale as well. And now being bloated with gas, the dead whale would rise to the surface, and that's when the whalers would come out, grab hold of the carcass and take it in to be processed for oil and baleen and whatever else they were taking from the whales. Now, the reason why I'm talking about this particularly is that, as mentioned, we saw this magnificent skeleton in the museum, and the skeleton was from the whale named Old Tom, that the whalers actually could identify individual whales by the shape of their dorsal fins, individual killer whales by their dorsal fins. And there was one particular whale who was called Old Tom, and Old Tom apparently was a real terror for grabbing hold of the ropes. He would grab the ropes and drag the boats around, and he was a bit of a character apparently. There are several stories, interesting stories about Old Tom. I can't remember them all, and I'm not going to try and tell them. But what is interesting is that one day, mysteriously, old Tom was found dead. He was just found dead, floating. He'd been washed into a bay, so the whalers took his body and they rendered him down for blubber, I suppose. But they also kept his skeleton. And that skeleton is now, old Tom's skeleton is now in the museum. And the reason why I think it's especially interesting is that I have a dental background, because when you look at his teeth, when you look at his mouth, at the skeleton of old Tom, you see two things that are dentally remarkable. One is that you can see extraordinary wear in the teeth from where he's grabbed hold of the whalers' boats. He must have pulled an awful lot of ropes for an awful lot of boats in order to wear the teeth down that much. Extraordinary amount of wear. In some places the teeth are just deeply notched. So that's just a remarkable example of dental wear, of occupational wear in dentistry. And in fact, in humans, you know, seamstresses traditionally had notches in their teeth from where they would hold needles, for example. But in any case, and carpenters as well, actually. In any case, old Tom had another interesting dental feature, and that was that on the other side of his jaw, on the upper jaw, he was missing two teeth. And where the teeth were missing, he was also missing a whole lot of bone. The bone that supports those teeth was largely lost. And it wasn't just fractured out, a nice clean edge. Those teeth, or rather that site, was irregularly eroded and worn away. And in fact, that's very typical of what you see in humans, where there's a long-standing chronic infection of the jaws. The bone is resorbed away. You get this irregular moth-eaten resorption in the site of long-standing chronic infection. And I actually rather suspect that this might be the explanation of what might have ultimately killed old Tom. You see, no one really knows how old Tom died. They only found his body, they didn't know what killed him. But I suspect that what might have happened is that one day, by misfortune, while he was tugging away on these ropes, he ripped out two teeth. Now this is a whale, there are no whale dentists around, okay? So it was a great big open gaping wound in his mouth. And he would have been eating, he would have been feeding. So old Tom would have been going down and biting and eating, and he would have been in that process stuffing fragments of meat and blubber up into that broken, fragmented bit of jaw, and that would have quietly rotted away and set up a long-standing chronic infection. And that long-standing chronic infection could account, or would explain, this irregular resorption of the bone. Now that's one thing. That would not necessarily have killed old Tom, in the same way as it wouldn't necessarily kill a human. Most people who have long-standing chronic dental infections, they just survive with it. It's not good for them, doesn't necessarily kill them. But if there's an acute flare-up in that long-standing chronic dental infection, certainly can kill you, can kill humans, and I suspect it may well have killed old Tom. Now remember that old Tom was a whale, a killer whale, eating mouth parts of other whales. Turns out that everybody's mouth is full of bacteria. I mean, there's dental plaque. Our mouths are just absolutely teeming with vast numbers of bacteria. There's a whole ecology of bacteria in each of us, in each mouth. And it turns out that different species have different colonies or different ecologies of bacteria for that particular species. So the human mouth has a particular ecology that's fairly typical of humans. Only certain species will survive in there, others won't. If you go to a bat, totally different ecology in the oral cavity. If you go to a whale, I imagine it would be very different again. And I would not be in the least bit surprised if you compared the oral ecology, the microbial ecology of killer whales, with that in blue whales or in humpback whales or sperm whales or any other whales, that each of those species would have different microbial ecologies. And those different microbial ecologies are such that the host species or another species might not have any immunity against infection by that. So there's old Tom. He's eating from the mouth, he's eating from the tongue, and he's eating from the lips. So he's getting the oral bacteria from whatever whale they've killed, not a killer whale, some other species. So he's getting a foreign species oral bacterial flora pumped into his jaw. Now normally that would not be a problem if the mouth is intact. Killer whales would be eating mouth parts all the time. That's not really a problem. the bacteria aren't going to cause any problem because they're not getting into the deep tissues of the animal, not going to set up an infection that they can't defend themselves against. But remember, poor old Tom, well, he was missing a great big part of his mouth. He had a great big hole in his jaw. So bacteria from a totally different species of whale have found their way in, bacteria against which he may well have had no resistance against at all. And I suspect that he grumbled along with this chronic infection for a long time until one day he got some bacteria by eating mouth parts from another whale that he had no defense against, and that's probably what killed him. Now, of course, I've got no proof for that other than my fevered imagination and the skeleton of old Tom, but to me that's a pretty reasonable explanation. Irrespective, I think it's good to know that chronic dental infection, although people can live with it for a long time, an acute dental flare-up, an acute flare-up in any long-standing chronic infection certainly can people, and there are thousands of people hospitalised every year here in Australia and elsewhere for preventable infections where they've had a chronic dental infection that's flared up and it's put them in hospital, and it's life-threatening. The only reason why they don't die is because they can get intravenous antibiotics and airway maintenance and surgical drainage. Other than that, they'd be dead. They'd end up like poor old Tom. So anyway, look, that's the story of old Tom. I think it's an interesting story. I hope you found that interesting. If you have enjoyed this and would like to see more, please like and subscribe and share if you wish. But whether you do or not, I'd like to thank you for your attention.